Alright, so to get started off here, let's bring up a brand new third-person shooter template. I'm not going to be running on 4.10, it just came out, but 4.9 is going to be running this uh, third-person shooter tutorial off of, because there's still a lot of updates and things that are transitioning over to 4.10 since it just recently came out. Even a lot of my animation packs don't go up to 4.10 right now, so in terms of assets I'll be using, I'll just be using the standard content that the third-person shooter comes with. I'll use the starter content so we have some objects to play with, and I will also be adding in the animation starter pack. If you don't have that, you can go into the launcher's marketplace, and it's absolutely free. You can add it up to 4.9 down to 4.3, and again, there's no 4.10, so this is why I'm doing it on 4.9. You can find it within the marketplace under the category of the characters and animations. So just click on characters and animations, it'll come down, and I believe it will be the last row if you have this fully maximized. This is where you'll find that. So with this editor's launching here, I'll be going through setting up our character with the camera being on his offset of his shoulder and allowing us to be able to rotate around him in a way. Games I've been looking at as an example. So yes, we'll do a new project. We'll do a blueprint project, third person. We'll just call this TPS tutorial. And let's do with starter content. And let's create our project. So back to what I was saying, so for games I've been looking at as an example while I'm building this, I've been playing a lot of Red Faction Guerrilla. Spec Ops: Align was one of those games where I got the head turning idea kind of that I wanted to redo or try to emulate. A lot of games do that kind of stuff too, like Grand Theft Auto and Gears of War. They do that too, like if your character is walking around and you're looking, like their body will kind of manipulate to look the direction that the player is looking. But yeah, like other than that, it's not going to be. I'm not going to have the camera system completely locked to his back, because I always feel like that's just kind of weird. Like the character's always kind of floating. But we'll have it where we actually have like 3 types of modes. Where one where the character is free floating, you can actually look all the way around. Where once you begin aiming, then it gets locked to his back over his shoulder, and then we'll have like a weapon ready state that the character will be walking around with the weapon ready to go if they just got out of an aiming state. But that'll be in the future for sure. A lot of this too comes from the proxy game I've been working on, so I worked on the third person character for that, and it'll be emulating a lot of it. Okay, so now that we have our map open, let's get started with positioning our camera behind our character. So anytime you open this up, actually before we do that, let's add our animation pack. So this is some of the starter content it comes with. We have our third person mesh that we can add. Just seeing what all this has. Okay, that's cool, that's a blueprint. So let's add in our animation starter pack so we have some additional animations to work with if we so choose. I have it already saved out in my library, so I'm going to add this to my project. And let's find the one I'm teaching on. Oh, add to project. That's going to take well, never mind, it's already done. So if we jump back over here, our animation starter pack has been added. So now we have some additional animations to play with if we need them. Alright, so let's go ahead and grab our third person character and let's start setting up his camera system. So if you were to play this right now, this would be more of not so much set up for a shooter type game. I think more for like an adventure or an MMO or a large open scale world type of game. I mean, this is better set up for, but I'm going to stick with more of the third person shooter characters. That's the type of characters I've done a lot of setups on. So let's jump into this character's blueprint, and we're going to start adjusting his camera position. There's going to be 2 things I'm going to go over for when you're moving the camera. When I first started messing with third person characters, One of the first things I did was I said I need my camera to be over his shoulder, and I should be able to just, let me turn snapping off. I should have been able to just like take the camera, move it into position. Let me move it back since the field of view is going to cut off his head because it'll be really up to his shoulders. Let's move back a little bit further, compile that. And I thought I could, if you take the tabs, you can just drag this off and just go like an internet browser here. So that way we can have our example map we can play and edit in. We can also go to our blueprint real quickly. And I thought like that would have been good. I'm like, okay, this target arm should be able to rotate this. This is going to be an extreme example because I didn't adjust the length of the target or the camera boom. So now if we play it, I thought this would have been fine. This is pretty close to what I was looking to do. Okay, but here's the problem. Usually when you play a lot of these games, when you run up to objects that have any collision, the camera should just bounce off and adjust to it. If you adjusted the camera off position, your camera is going to start going through objects because it's not going to respect the collision. The reason my camera is so out of whack and moving really far away is because that camera boom is what's detecting the collision. It's wanting to adjust my camera. So real quickly, let's adjust that the correct way. Or one way I have found. There's a million different ways you can do things, but this is the one I'm finding that's working pretty well. So let's undo, Control Z. Now we're back to where we first started. So I know the camera boom needs to be in the center point origin of our character because this is where we want to rotate around. We want to be up more towards his back, center of his back, because we're going to be rotating around the upper portion of him. And we want to bring our camera boom down a lot. So let's bring that down to about 100. And what we want to do is we want to move our camera over to the shoulder, but we can't just take his camera and move it again, or else we get that collision clipping problem that we had before. What we can do is we can take the camera boom, we can come down into its details tab and come down to the area where it says camera, same place where we adjusted the target arm length. And the socket offset, we can actually offset the camera to be at different positions around this character wherever we so choose we want it to be. So if I were to adjust this to, let's say, 55 to the Y to be over his shoulder, and we go back, we compile, and we hit play, our camera's pretty close to where we want it to be. The good thing is now if we walk up to a wall and we rotate, our camera is going to respect our camera is going to act the way it should with the environment and actually bounce off the environment's collision instead of clipping through it. So that was one thing I wish I had known before, but I didn't read enough into. Now for target offset, that'll offset it up and down same way. It's kind of closest to socket offset, but let's add a little bit of Z depth, about like 5 I want to say. I'm just going to check some of my settings. Since I've done this before, I just want to make sure I'm setting everything up the correct way. Because as I'm going through these videos, I'm also building the project on my end, on another end as well. Instead of 5, let's just bring that down to 0, and let's just bring this up just a bit more around the back of his neck. Alright, that's feeling pretty good. Cool. So now we have our camera in position. Next thing we want to do is we want to handle the issue we were seeing with walking up to objects and our camera was going through our character, like right there where it's clipping through our character. I mean, it's not a huge eyesore, but at the end of the day, I don't want people to see the inside of my models, I mean, or any of our skeleton meshes. So let's hide our character, and then once our camera gets out of the way of the mesh, let's make our character appear again. It's not too complicated of a script. It's actually pretty easy. It does use an event tick. Event ticks can be costly if they're not used correctly. So we'll jump over into our event graph, and let's first grab an event tick. We don't have any, so we'll right click, do event tick. I am one that I'll try not to use event ticks if I can help it, because this is something that always constantly runs, just like your input axis and turn rate constantly run. These are always constantly running because these are things that your player is going to be looking around the world. So this is always going to need to be constantly be fed. Well, for our situation with the camera clipping through our character's body, that's the camera movement, and our camera movement is being controlled by our player. So, I mean, that is pretty important for it to be updated all the time. So what we can do is we first need to add two objects that'll say, hey, if this object intersects the other one, we want to turn off our mesh, and then when it leaves, we can turn it back on. An easy way I found to do this is, instead of having to have the camera do the talking to the capsule, since this is a pretty close radius of where our character is going to be, let's add a collision component, since that's what it technically does. It's a collider. It's going to collide against something and something's going to happen, because you can also expose overlap events for these collision components, which is great. I've used them hundreds of times on things. Let's name our collision component. I use this sphere collision component because it's pretty generic. It's not precise. There's no points. It's just an overall area. Let's call this a camera visibility sphere. Alright, and let's take our sphere, and we want to, our collision sphere, and let's attach it by clicking and drag it down onto the follow camera. If you notice, our collision sphere is in the middle of our character. We want it to be up near the camera. Instead of having to manually adjust this, we can just go over to the details panel, go to transform, down to location, and just click on reset to default, and that'll center up right on our camera for us, since it's now reading the origin point, or where it's parented to, as the follow camera. We also don't want a huge radius for this thing, because like if we're even in game and our character just goes up to any wall, we don't want it to just disappear before we get that close to the character. So let's bring our sphere radius down in the details panel, go down to shape, and bring our sphere radius down to about 12. 12 should be enough to let us get close enough to the character to see all the cool little details, but enough to be able to stop us from seeing the inside of our character. I want this to be a little bit inside the camera too, so I think that'll at least detect when our visibility gets close. Now that we have a visibility sphere, excuse me, if I can talk, we want to check to make sure that our visibility sphere collision is not going to have any issues with this capsule component. So we need to check our collision settings, and everything should be on overlap all dynamic. If it is not, make sure that it is, because we just need this to read events off to us. We don't want it to do any simulating in the game world or interfering with the character at all. And for our camera, if it does intersect our capsule, we don't want our camera to just bounce off our capsule. So we can select our capsule, or we can select it through our components, and we'll check out its collision settings as well. We can come down to collision presets, pawn, and it says pawn, which is good, but we see that it's there to block the camera, which we don't want. So we can drop down pawn, we can drop that into custom, which will allow us to change our settings. And if we come down to camera, we'll just do overlap. So now the camera can freely move inside this capsule component with no problems at all, without having any interferences. So let's compile and save this. And now let's go ahead and write some code for these two spheres to talk to each other. So what we want to do is we have to say, if our capsule component, there's two ways you can do this in the event graph. One, you can either right click and we say we needed to get our capsule component, which is get capsule components. Okay. I have a hard time like trying to speak and talk at the same time, but I know it's capsule, and usually a lot of these components will always show up at the bottom. And there it is. We can either do it this way, or what I like to do is I just like to go up to the components and just click, drag, and drop it right down at the blueprint, so I can easily just access these from wherever. And we know our camera visibility sphere is going to be the other part that's going to intersect. So we need to say, if our capsule component intersects our visibility sphere, either or, we need something to trigger off to tell our mesh to go away, to hide. So we can drag off this wire, and we can get is overlap. And it says is overlapping component, because these are two components. And we can hold down B to drag in to call in a branch. A branch is basically an if statement, so we can connect our is overlap component to our branch statement. Let's connect our event tick into the branch, and we will say if our capsule component is overlapping our camera visibility sphere, we want something to happen. So we can do some debugging by holding down. Let's go ahead and do a print string. I use these I use these all over the place to first test like a lot of components and mechanics, make sure things work or whatnot. So let's copy this and let's paste it below, and let's type in the description of should hide the mesh, and let's change the description is mesh should be visible, and that should be for false. So what this is basically doing is it's taking every event tick as the game plays. It's going to be doing a check to see, hey, is this capsule component overlapping our visibility sphere? If it is, then we need to print this string or a message up on the corner that says it should hide the mesh, or it should be taking our character and hiding it. If it's not, then it should be visible to the player. Let's compile and save, and let's go ahead and play, and mesh should be visible, so it's ticking every second. So now, once we intersect that capsule, it should then change our message to should hide the mesh. Mesh should be visible, so it is working. See, I'm getting some clip in there too, but I mean, it's going to be hiding before we even get that close, so it should be good. Now that we know our debug is working, or this is actually reading, let's go ahead and we need to do something to our mesh. So we can again drag our mesh in, or any skeletal mesh that's being used in this slot, it'll just read that mesh that's holding this slot here. So if you were to replace this with another skeletal mesh or another custom character you made, it'll read what's in there and do whatever you're asking to do to it. So we know that if we intersect this, we need to take the mesh and we need to do an owner no C. What this is doing is it should hide the mesh. We can copy this, we can paste that below, take our mesh, and we can drag it into the target as well. It's kind of doing the same thing we just had already set up with the print strings. And we want to do is make sure this is checked true. So that way only the owner is not going to see this mesh. Everybody else in the game world, if they're playing online, will be able to see it, but the owner is not going to be seeing the mesh. So it prevents the character from clipping and turning invisible to everyone else. It looks really ridiculous. So if we compile, save it, let's play it. And if we're running around the game world and we come up to the wall and we get really close. Oh, I think our character, yep, okay, it's not just me. Let's do that one more time, and our character is now turning invisible. Cool, so that's just a small little feature to get working. Just one of those things that was just bugging me like crazy. But from there, our next setup is we're going to be going through and we will set up something for, I want to say, let's get started on getting our character aiming next. So from that, we'll save it, and the next video we'll start setting up our characters to be able to start reading on replication for online, so the other players know when our character is aiming, and setting up our our animation blueprint for the character aiming correctly with another animation. So we'll stop it there, and I'll see you in the next video.